Hello, everybody. Flower strike. Oh, yes, this is my free Burma t-shirt. Today, I was in the park with a friend and a free Iran slash solidarity with women in Iran protest happened, and I was wearing this. And it was a good protest. I support the cause. And then I walked just a little further, and the Free Burma protest was happening. Apparently, it happens every Saturday in front of City Hall in my city. So, good timing again. So, what my plan is for today, I'm going to make a quick correction on my last video, and then I'm going to do another little flashback to a childhood experience in Sausalito. And then I am going back to Belize to cover some of the things I talked about in my last video, but I left out some details. Yeah. So, and if I feel like going on and talking about Guatemala after that, we'll see. Maybe I will. Okay. So my first correction, I talked about, I said that these preteen girls in Barranco who said he looks good gal. Anyway, they weren't preteens, I don't think. They were probably early teens. So maybe like 13, and I was 15, so it wasn't that much younger. But when they get to high school age, which is about 14, then they tend to leave for a long time and don't come back except on vacations because the town has no high school. And the Garifuna actually do value education when it's available. All right. So here's my childhood flashbacks. I'm in Sausalito. I'm in, it's 1973, so I must have been about 11. The oil cartels, the Arab oil cartels had put the squeeze on the U.S., so there was a fuel shortage, and they had lots of strange things like fuel rationing, and then also they set the clock back, and they may have set the school schedule back too. I was in, I was in about 6th grade. And I remember waking up, the alarm clock was set for the usual time. I woke up and it was completely dark. I had never woken up for school and the sky was dark like that. And I was sure that it was a dream. I didn't think it was real, but I decided to go through the motions anyway in this dream that I was in of getting ready for school and walking and then going towards school. So I did, and then I was walking outside, and then the sun started coming up. And only when the sun came up and it got light did I finally accept that this was really happening and that it was not a dream. Right. Another time when I was a child, I remember playing, I was barefoot playing with in the creek. This is around, Northern California. I felt something ouchy on my ankle and I pulled my foot out and there was something that looked like a black slug and I pulled it off. There was some blood on my ankle and now I know that it was a leech, and never seen or heard of leeches anywhere in California before or since, so that was strange. When I was like 14, I was in another part of Marin County, and I did see a black scorpion, which scared me. I saw another one later in Belize. I did not know that the black ones basically give you like a bee sting, and it's the white ones, which are not in California or Belize. They're in the Southwest and in Mexico. Anyhow, those are the ones that can kill you. I saw it and I was scared. I smashed it. And back then, there was this goofy thing that they advertised on TV where you could have like this loudspeaker on the top of your car. And they showed these teenager guys saying, "I'll be back to pick you up later," to some girls. And that was supposed to be convince you. This idiotic behavior was supposed to convince you to buy the gizmo. And I think it works sometimes, because as I was smashing the Scorpion, I heard this voice coming from a loudspeaker in a car, and it said, "Kill it," which I did. All right, that was a detour. Now let's get back to where I left off last time and fill in some details. Yeah, so where I left off, my parents had come to visit me in Belize City, taken me to Gales Point and back, and then left. So I was on my own in Belize City for a couple of days. The bus to Punta Gorda only ran twice a week back then, so I probably had a couple of days to kill. I remember I met this one blonde, white American woman, and she took a picture of me with a big stalk of sugar cane in my arm and over my shoulder, and she gave me a copy, and I still have it somewhere. But after my parents left, I was walking around, and there was like this other middle-aged American white guy, and he was like ragging on Belize, and don't remember all he said, but he said, "And everybody has their hand out, from the prime minister to the boy on the street." And I was genuinely offended. And I said so. I said something back by this obnoxious American dude ragging on this country that I was kind of in love with at the time, I guess. Yeah. And then maybe the same night, maybe another night, I was going back to this place I was staying in Belize City, which was a dorm that I paid a little for, and shared it with two young German women. But I was in like the central, pretty well lit and well traveled. There were people around part of Belize City. And these two guys backed me up a wall and said, "Give me all your money." And I guess I started crying. And one of them said, "Oh, he's crying. Let him go." So then I continued. But now I was in a darker part of Belize City, darker with less people. And they followed me. And so they put me up against a wall and demanded my money again. And I obviously I gave it to them. I think I had some back at the room. Fortunately, I must have had. And so I was upset. I returned to the room really crying. But I also kind of felt betrayed, because they didn't know that, but I had just defended their country against a fellow American. And I felt like it was like, it was slapping me back. I was like, "Geez, I just defended your country, and now you're doing this to me." Pretty irrational. But that's how I felt at that moment. All right. Then I took the bus back to Punta Gorda. And since I'm back in Garifuna territory now, Punta Gorda, Barranco, Livingston, I'm going to be in it for a while again. So I want to report this little anecdote. So one thing about the Garifuna, which is this hybrid Black indigenous American ethnic group, they were smart, whether they were educated or not. And educated usually meant they had a high school degree, because there wasn't really any college. There was, I guess, in Belize City, a teacher's credential school. But anyhow, regardless, they were pretty smart. So I remember Vanessa telling me that she was 21. She said, when I was pregnant, from the time, maybe it was the hormones, but from the time I'd get home, basically when she was pregnant, from the time she got home every day, she wanted to have sex with her boyfriend, and she did. And in retrospect, yeah, so there isn't really access to, this was like 1978, and in this remote area, but she knew about hormones. She knew that they could increase your sex drive, and she knew that they were higher when you're pregnant, and she put all that is true. She put all that together. So that's just an example. They fairly sexual and pretty intelligent. It was common for them to be speak foreign languages and so forth. And when I got to Livingston, one of them had somehow picked up a book, a Hare Krishna book in Spanish, and had read it and been influenced by it. There weren't a lot of books. There wasn't a lot of information, but they retained what they learned what they could, and they retained a lot of what they learned. So that's Garifuna in Punta Gorda. And then I went back with these traveling musicians, these American white traveling musicians that I had connected with. And we went back to Barranco, and I stayed in the house that I usually stayed in with these 4 former Peace Corps volunteers, 3 of whom, well, 2 of whom were American, and 1 of whom was English, and 1 of whom was Salvadorian. She wasn't a Peace Corps volunteer, but one of them met her in El Salvador. So I stayed there, and they had a general rule that you were supposed to pay $2.50 a day while you stayed with them, which included food. So it was $2.50. It was a good deal. Even then and there, it was a pretty good deal. But I had scored this ounce bud of marijuana from some Mayans that lived nearby. And so I just thought, if I shared that was something I could do instead of paying the $2.50. To be fair, I didn't have much money on me. And so we would get stoned, and I would read my trashy American novel I'd gotten somewhere. And then this guy, and he wasn't one of the normal ones that lived there. He was another white American guy. And he kind of took me aside, and he said, you've been sitting here reading your book. You haven't been paying the $2.50 that we generally ask for, and you haven't been helping out with any of the chores or anything. So he kind of, read me, scolded me or whatever, reasonably so. So after that, I started paying and possibly trying to help out, although I don't think there was that much I could really do. Okay. And then I went with the traveling musicians to Livingston, Guatemala. And okay, I have time. By the way, if you hear something in the background, that might be my dishwasher, which is going on and off. So I went to the predominantly Garifuna village of Livingston in Guatemala, which I had been to before for a weekend with Vanessa. So first I found the house where Vanessa's Guatemalan Garifuna relatives lived. And I was kind of like, hey, remember me? Could I, stay here for a bit? And they were like, no, no. So I'm like, okay. So I met this other young Garifuna man. Vanessa's relatives didn't really speak English. And I don't think their Spanish was completely the Garifunas didn't quite speak standard Spanish. I know that because I asked for a baño, which in most Spanish-speaking places means a toilet, a bathroom, a toilet. And they didn't understand what I was talking about, which was very frustrating because I really needed one and didn't know where one was. Anyway, some of them, though, were language whizzes and could speak standard English, Belizean Creole, Garifuna, and Spanish. Nicholas definitely, that was his name. He could definitely speak English, and he was actually very nice to me. I hadn't met him before. He took me in. He had a little place where, as I described, this very simple Livingston Garifuna architecture where they made a frame for a little shack out of this local bamboo, which was thin, and then they made both the roof and the walls out of dried palm leaves, coconut palm thatch. And then to fill in all the cracks, because obviously there were gaps, they did this thing where they took wet newspaper. They took ordinary newspapers they probably found somewhere and wet flour and plastered it all over the wall. And of course, he had no electricity or running water. And as was typical in such cases down there, which was the great majority of people, he had a kerosene lamp. And I knew how to light that and everything by then. And I remember coming home one night and the place was dark. And I just heard this crunch, crunch, crunch sound. And I turned the kerosene lamp on and looked around, and there were these big, like mouse-sized, pretty big cockroaches just eating the flour off the walls. So that was a bit of a shock, a little startling, but I still stayed there. And then another night, when I was there by myself and Nicholas had gone somewhere else, probably with a girlfriend or something, I don't know. This woman, I don't know how old she was, but she was a bit older, could have been maybe 30s or something, I don't know. She showed up, she knocked on the door. She was drunk, obviously, and she was brandishing like a steak knife. And and she was like, "Where's Nicholas?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Nicholas, no forking good." Something like forking. Okay. And then we started talking, and I ended up going home with them, as any sensible person would after meeting a crazy drunk woman brandishing a steak knife. So I went to her place, and she patted the space on the bed next to it, and she we had coital knowledge, we had intercourse, and then maybe I didn't quite perform up to her standards, and she made, put me off the bed, and I had to sleep on the floor, which made me kind of mad. And then in the morning, she patted the space next to her on the bed again, and I was like, nah. And then it's funny. I think I went from this really hypersexual period when I was 14, late 14 or early 15, where I was just hooking up with a bunch of different girls and women. But I think I had a couple of emotionally bruising encounters in a row. I didn't fully understand the emotional impact that these sorts of things can have, either for the people that I was doing it with, or for myself. But I'd gotten a little bruised emotionally, and I went into this kind of abstinent / asexual phase. Not really asexual, because I still, saw women and was attracted to them. But I decided, for vaguely spiritual reasons, I was still vaguely spiritual, to just be abstinent for a while. And when an opportunity arose or seemed to be arising, I would simply not take it. That's what I did for a while. I mean, when I got back from Belize, when I got back to Belize, the locals thought it was pretty weird that I had gone from like this player to this abstainer. They didn't give me any credit. I'm one of them, I had been scolded for being too young to fool around with girls, women, and so forth by a police officer. I hadn't been yet, but I would be. But this guy told me, I'd become a solid punk. But it's all right, because he didn't have to feel it. I was the one who had to feel it. So they didn't really approve. That was later, back in Belize. But in Livingston, I met this group of, again, well, mostly white, one was black, Americans who were with the Rainbow family. This was the first time I had ever encountered the Rainbow family. And they're still around. Remember, way back then, somebody said, those guys are like a million years ago. That was 1978, and they're still around. It's funny, these things can go in cycles, where first they're new and shocking, and then people say they're old and passé. But when people keep doing them, at some point it just becomes like kind of its own thing. It kind of becomes a traditional unto itself. But that wasn't happening yet. They were still viewed as old and passé by other Americans. But I liked them, so I got along with them. There was this older guy, I'll call him Nathaniel, this middle-aged Rainbow family guy, and I spent some time with, and I was with him, and in this cafe, I was sitting with him and another two women. They were somewhat older, not super attractive, Spanish, light-skinned by their standards. And I'm reasonably sure they were prostitutes. So I went up to one of them and said, do you know what time it is? Or maybe I said it in Spanish, que hora es. And she didn't say anything. She just like sort of held my wrist and pulled my hand towards between her legs. And it's like, yeah, I was kind of, using an opening line, which, by the way, that line sometimes works, which has made me conclude that pickup lines do not have to be clever at all. You just have to say something. It's good enough to say something kind of neutral. And then if they're into you, it'll work. And if it's not, they're not, it won't. So, but I didn't expect quite a quick, going from 1 to 11 so quickly. So I pulled my hand back and I said, we can't do that in public. There were only 4 of us. And Nathaniel said, you can get down and eat it for all I care. But I didn't. I declined, the implied offer. And I think he thought also that this was kind of strange. Yeah. So there was this other house. It wasn't the place we were living, but there was this other house. Oh yeah, and the floors of these places was packed mud, so hard, really not bad. It's not dirty unless you get it wet. There was this other house, basically the same kind of place, but bigger. So one of the Rainbow family men, I'll call him John, he had, he had paid some locals to take him out to find some magic mushrooms. And he came back. He had eaten, it was pretty clear he'd eaten some. And I said, hey, how's the mushrooms? And he said, I ain't into talking. I'm like, all right. So, I ate some. Nathaniel ate some. And then after we'd already eaten them, he said, don't fork with those mushrooms, something to that effect. And I'm like, now you tell us. A minute ago, before we ate them, you weren't into talking. And now that they're already in our stomach, you're telling us not to mess with them. Anyway, we went to the house. Nathaniel was okay because he was more experienced than the rest of us. And I believe he had taken only the real psilocybin mushroom. So he just had a mushroom high. But we had taken a combination of the psilocybin mushrooms and the some poisonous mushrooms. Yeah. When I first started feeling them, I said, oh, I was on the beach and I said, this is such a perfect place to trip. But somehow I wound back up at this house that Nicholas had access to. And I started getting sick. And so did everybody else except Nathaniel that had eaten these mushrooms. So I was high because some of them had been the right kind. And I was also sick because some of them had been the wrong kind. And the sickness basically manifested. My body was trying to get rid of this toxin as quickly as possible. So, not to be too direct, it was coming out from both ends. And I puked first on his floor, and, he didn't love that. So he took me outside, which is good because there was plenty more where that came from. And, yeah, so not super pleasant. At some point, he gave me some indigenous medicine called bitters, which I didn't like because they were bitter. They were a drink of some kind of boiled plant, and it tasted not good. And I hurled again, and I said, "Why you did do this to me? I mean, why do you do this to me?" And of course, now I realize he was being a freaking angel. Like, he basically turned this house into a clinic for these for these small group of stupid Americans. At first, he didn't know what was going on, and I said, "We ate some mushrooms," and he didn't understand. And then we took them out of the bag and showed him one that was left, and he said, "Ungus," which must be, I guess, Spanish for mushrooms. And he said, "Oh, you don't flirt with ungos." And I'm like, I heard that a little while ago, but it's a little kind of too late, even more too late, because they were not only in my belly, they were fully circulating. And there was nothing I could do to get rid of them any quicker than what my body was already desperately doing. Good times, good times. Later, yeah, so later another American guy was talking about that too, and he said, "Well, you could have died, if that means anything to you." And he was absolutely right. The wrong kind of mushrooms can definitely kill you. And then I learned how to properly identify psilocybin mushrooms. So in the future, I was able to do that, because they're brown and on top, and then there's a white. There's no like gills underneath. It's smooth. And if you touch them, it bruises. It turns blue where you thump them. But I didn't know any of that until later. So Nicholas, yes, Nicholas introduced us to another couple, and this was a Garifuna guy who was married to a white blonde Canadian woman, and they were living in a even more remote area that there were no regular boats going back and forth. You had to go on your own boat, or someone had to take you there. So we got to go, me and John and Nicholas got in this boat with these couple, and it wasn't like, it was a canoe, not like I was used to the Garifuna dories. It was thinner and kind of wobbled back and forth. And we had one oar. It wasn't like a kayak oar with a part on both ends. It was one oar. So I was rowing for a while, and I learned how to row on one side and then row on the other side. And while I was down there, I learned all the stuff about row left if you want to go right, and right if you want to go left. And it's the same on a motorboat. You turn the lever right if you want to go left, and left if you want to go right. And this wasn't a motorboat. This was a very old school wobbly canoe. But they got there, and Nicholas, no, it was the other Garifuna man was named Silly. I'm giving real names when they didn't do anything that I think they would object to being made public, in the very unlikely event that they or someone they knew ever saw this, heard this. So Silly had an empty house, which I guess had been his grandfather's house. And I suppose out of respect, he kept it empty most of the time. But he had guests. Um, when he had guests, he let us sleep there, which was nice, you know. So me and John basically had the place to myself. I think at one point I almost knocked over a kerosene lamp because it wasn't on a table, it was just on the ground. And John said, "You almost burned down grandfather's house." And I'm like, oops. And at one point, Nicholas gave me this bowl of liquid again. And I drank it, and it was bitters, which still tasted bad even when I was not on any kind of intoxicants or poisons. And I said, ew, you know, I was 15. I was like, ew. And later, John said, you know, you might want to try not stepping on people's toes, you know, like basically being a little more polite. If a Rainbow Family guy had to tell me that, because they were way out of the mainstream, these were old school 1960s Haight-Ashbury hippies is how they still lived, you know. All the men had long hair. They all smoked weed and took psychedelics, you know, mushrooms and LSD on a regular basis. John also drank alcohol when it was around. Actually, so did Nathaniel. That's another story for later. But yeah, it was a bit of a time warp. And if you go to a rainbow gathering now, man, it's like a time warp. So, what else? Oh, yes. So they had like not a farm, but a garden. And when you're in the tropics and you're growing stuff, just like in Moho Bowl, the vegetation is always trying to reclaim the space. And so these vines kept growing towards their crops, which were, I don't know, maybe cassava, whatever. And so they had this tool, which was basically it was a L-shaped stick. So it was a piece of wood that went down and then went over that way. I had that in one hand and a machete in the other. So instead of mowing the lawn, this is what we did. I lifted the vines with one hand and cut them with a machete and did this for a while. And after a while, I got like blisters. And then the blisters started breaking and actually bled a little, which enabled me to say that I worked until my hands were bleeding, which was literally true. I told that to one woman, and I said, but they didn't bleed that much, really. And she said, but it makes a good story, which was true. And they were living there without much money at all. They told me that when they did have some money, the first thing they would do with it is buy a little weed, and then they'd spend it on whatever else. Yeah, there were some people down there that were able to live a virtually cash-free existence because they largely got their food from the land, but mostly, if they were Garifuna, mostly from the sea. By this time, I was broke because I had a check from my parents for 25 US dollars, but I didn't know how to cash it. which turned out to be a good thing. And this whole time when I was in Guatemala, I was carrying this check around, but not able to cash it. And so I was living on the charity once again of, hippies, Garifuna, a Spanish truck driver, Mayans, Seventh-day Adventists, like anybody, everybody that was there. So then we went back from this town to Livingston, and I met up with some other Westerners. There were that were kind of affiliated with the Rainbow family, and one of them was a white, maybe Canadian guy who he had a girlfriend or wife or whatever that was Honduran, and she didn't speak that much English, but she spoke some. And I remember we were talking about going to the rest of Guatemala, and I said, well, I don't really have any money to travel any further. I don't have any money. And she said, you keep saying that you can't travel anymore because you don't have money. That's bullshit. And what I took her to mean at the time was, even though you don't have any money, you can still, continue to travel. Thinking that you can't is bullshit. What I later realized she actually was saying was that she did not believe that a white American didn't have any money. She simply, people a lot, they're, in poor places, people will just refuse to accept that fact, even though there are some highly disorganized travelers like me that do bum around, adventurous / disorganized / overly ambitious, that do wind up bumming around in third world countries, broke, like I did. One time we were sitting in yet another somebody's hut. There was this Norwegian woman had smuggled a small amount of Belizean marijuana into Livingston, which is a bad idea, but she had smuggled it in her personal area that the guards could not have detected unless they had done a body cavity check, which mostly they wouldn't, unless they were, you were really, really seriously entering the jail system, which was a bad thing, but she hadn't. She just came into the country, and then she pulled this stuff from inside herself, which I later said might have been why it was so good, tasted so good, whatever. And we rolled it up in brown paper, like always, and smoked it. And we turned the radio on, and it was a station from New Orleans this time. Or it was a station from the United States, which I think most likely was New Orleans, but I can't be sure. They played this song called No Easy Run because it was the late 1970s and there was a bit of a faddish interest in truckers at the time. So this trucker was talking about how there was the no easy run, meaning no easy trip across the country carrying goods. And he said, at the end, he said, how about Detroit on a Friday afternoon? And the thing is that he was describing this highly industrialized, from my point of view, the United States and this highly industrialized thing that they did of driving trucks through areas with lots of cars, and I hadn't experienced that for a while, and it was an odd, situation. Later, when I got to mainland Guatemala, I off of the peninsula there, I I did hitch a ride with a trucker, so I found out, yeah, they have truckers there too, but the country is smaller, so they don't take these huge runs, I guess, like they do in the U.S. So I had now conceived the idea. I think I spent about a month in Livingston, maybe 2 weeks, and then a month in the rest of Guatemala, and another 2 weeks back in Livingston before I went back to Belize. Yeah, I used to say that when I was 15, I spent 2 months wandering around Guatemala with no money during a civil war. It turns out that was basically, I only did that for 1 month, not two, because the other month I spent in Livingston, which the revolution apparently never really reached. But nevertheless, there were these cops, cops and or soldiers, but probably they're just cops. But they walked around everywhere with these huge guns. Later, I learned probably from the USA, huge guns which were inappropriate to carry in a society. It was just a small town, a village, really. So, but unlike what people think, there's this general idea about fascist societies, which it basically it was a fascist nation, especially once you left the Livingston area, that they at least, they can keep the crime down. When people say there's too many thugs running wild, then they want a strong, tough leader to rein it in. But that really wasn't happening. What I saw down there, and it might have been there anyway, I don't know. But there was this general normalization of casual violence. So I've already given you one example, the woman coming to the hut brandishing a steak knife. So there were a couple more. This Spanish guy showed me his place, and he dried fish there. So it had dry fish. And then I misunderstood that. Probably I wanted to misunderstand that as meaning that I could stay there and that I could help myself to some of the dried fish. When the door was locked, I climbed in through the window. And then when I came back, he just looked at me and was pointing a pistol. And I'm like, okay, I get the message. All right. And I walked away and did not come back to that house. There was a third incident. I was, in this place where they serve food and beer and such like. I was talking to these two. Well, one was a teenager, one was, I guess, in her 20s. They spoke Belizean English, and I don't know if they were part Garifuna or what. They weren't really dark. They were kind of brown. And there was this drunk Spanish guy, and they were talking to probably in Spanish. I didn't understand. But at some point, the one in her 20s picked up a beer bottle and no, wait. The one in her 20s, like, just kind of picked the guy up, put her hands under her arms and escorted him to the back of the building. And then the teenage girl, her sister, I would assume, or half sister, she picked up the neck of a beer bottle and smashed it, which then transforms it into this deadly weapon. And then she followed behind her sister and the guy. Exactly what happened back there, I do not know. And that was probably just as well. But shortly thereafter, they came back. No broken bottle in anybody's hands. And the woman said, "Well, me sorry, but me got vexed," meaning I apologize, but I got angry. And therefore I did whatever awful thing she did. And once I got to the rest of Guatemala, it generally wasn't better. In some places, it was kind of worse, I think. I mean, most of the people were nice to me, unless I did stupid things like breaking into their home and taking some of their food or whatever. But yeah, the genocide of the Mayan people, whom I was I did later spend some time with, had begun. I did not know that. The Mayan people in Guatemala, though, that is, the ones in Belize and wherever else. Well, I don't know about anywhere else, but the ones in Belize were safe. And later, a lot of them migrated to Livingston and to Belize, including the ones that ended up living on my land in Mohobul, but I may have told that story. So it had begun, but it was only just starting. Lucas Serrat Presidente was a slogan along with Belice Guatemala. It was a slogan I heard a lot on their local radio station. And elections were coming up, and they were putting up posters for these different candidates. I took a look at the posters. 3 of the candidates were generals, and 1 was a lieutenant. So there was no question that there was going to be military leadership. And there wasn't very much question in my mind, even at that point, that Lucas Garcia, Generalissimo Lucas Garcia, was going to win, because there were way more posters for him. There was way more advertising and publicity of all sorts for him than for all the other candidates combined. So it was fixed. It was a pretense of a democracy. That was pretty evident to me even then. This guy was he was pasting up these signs on the wall, and he tried to get me to help him out for free, and I might have done one and then said nah. And yeah, the beach there was kind of nice, although I saw things in it like the carcass of a dog. And perhaps because of that, not only pelicans, but I think also vultures hung around there. I went with some Rainbow family people and a couple other Westerners. We hiked to a creek that they knew about in order to get, well, it wasn't a creek, it was like a watering hole, not exactly a pond, more like the kind of place where there's a waterfall and there's a big area where water gathers for a while, but it's not stagnant and it's pretty nice to swim in. So we walked there, but on the way, there was this creek that we had to forge, pretty fairly wide and deep. So being hippies, we just took all our clothes off at that point and just waded through it, and then just kept our clothes in our arms as we walked the rest of the way, and then swam naked. There was this there was this Garifuna boy who was about 12 or so, and one of the women said that he was tagging along. One of the women said that she observed him looking at them naked and masturbated, which doesn't sound implausible. So after that, I started calling him El Mono, which wasn't polite, but and at some point he said, "Char up, you boy no good," in the best English he could manage. When I first got to Livingston, there was this clique of teenagers, including one, he was an albino with clearly African features. So he was black albino, if that's not a contradiction in terms, and they called him Gringo. Anyways, I was hanging out with this group of teenagers, and they were like accepting me. And then when I started hanging out with the Rainbow family and these other Westerners, I was like stopped hanging out with them, and I'd see them and I'd just pass them. I think they took offense at that, and I heard one of them say, "You are half and half," meaning half man, half woman. So, they were casting aspersions on my masculinity because they kind of felt like I had snubbed them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't handle that as smoothly as I could, but when you've been in a foreign country for a long time, and especially when you get to a place where a lot of people don't speak your language, when you meet other travelers, no matter how down you are with hanging out with the locals, which I definitely was, you still want to take a break and meet with the other travelers and, trade travel stories in your own language that you actually know. And obviously in Belize, I learned to understand and speak the language pretty well because it was a form of English. Anyhow, I don't have to apologize. That's just what happened. And then they told me they were leaving Livingston, the Rainbow family folk, and they were headed towards this town up in the mountains of Guatemala called Panajachel. And for some reason, I missed my chance to go with them. They might have paid the bus fare, very likely. I got this advice from another foreigner. He said, when you go to get your visa extended, tell them you want 3 months. It's kind of like bartering. If you tell them that you want 3 months, they'll probably only give you 2 months. But if you'd ask for 2 months, they might not even give you that much. So I kept that in mind. And unlike Belize, where you can really ignore the visas, the visa requirements, and you kind of want to because they only give you a 1 week at a time, 1 or 2 weeks visa. So it's funny because they like give you a very short time on your visa, but then they don't really do anything when you overstay it, except scold you a little when you're leaving. Yeah. So I took the bus, not the bus. I took the ferry boat by myself back to the city of Puerto Barrios, which I'd been on a day trip to before. And I was headed towards Guatemala City. I was going to say in Guatemala City, they give you a longer visa, but it's not something you want to mess around with. It's not the kind of place you want to stay on an expired visa because you didn't want to get in trouble with the law there. Even though I slightly did, but that's another story. Anyway, I was going to have it renewed in Guatemala City, but first I had to get there. And somehow I found out how to hitchhike in the right direction. And that's when I was picked up by a truck driver, a Spanish truck driver. And when I say Spanish, I mean ethnically Spanish rather than mixed with indigenous or African blood or Indian or whatever, East Indian. So he was Spanish and he was nice to me. And, he stopped somewhere. They gave me some food and I acted like a brat by climbing up the wall and walking on the top of it. And they told me to, some woman told me to come down. You can't do that with you couldn't do that with a lot of the walls there because they were pretty serious about keeping intruders out. And a lot of the walls had like broken bottles, broken glass embedded in the cement. So that was one way of deterring unwelcome visitors. So I think he might have taken me all the way to Guatemala City, and then we parted company. And I was like, well, I've never been here before. I don't have much money left, and I don't know where to stay. And somehow I wound up walking into this alley, which turned out to be, you could call it a homeless encampment. You could also call it an urban Mayan village. It was both of those things, Some clearly from the countryside, Mayans had set up a little encampment there. And so I came in and, basically, I don't know, they gave me some biscuits or something and they let me crash there, which I shouldn't have done. I should have crashed I don't know, maybe there were worse things that could have happened. I remember I was sharing a room with this old lady. She was old to me. And I remember there was some noise and she basically said ratos, which I understood to mean that they were rats. But worse than that, there were fleas, and there were so many fleas, and I was getting bitten right all night long. And I remember I showed that to another traveler, and he said, yeah, 2 or 3 of those, and I would have walked out of there. But I didn't. I just stayed and got bitten up. And I didn't get much sleep. So I got up in the morning, and at this point I hadn't slept much. I had probably hadn't eaten all that much. My metabolism at that age was a little off anyway. Sometimes I would faint when I stood up quickly. And I'd lost a bunch of blood to these little flea monsters. But I did manage to find the place to get my visa extended. I had my passport with me. I stood in a line, and I remember getting to the end of the line, handing my passport to the guy and saying, as I'd been advised to, "Tres mes, por favor." And then I passed out cold right in front of him. And I vaguely remember some guy dragging me, and so, somebody gave me my passport back, and I looked at the visa. The guy had said, if you ask for 3, you'll probably get more. But he had stamped 3 months, the whole amount I'd asked for. So he probably felt sorry for me. You would think that, being like that would get me a lesser visa, but no, turned out it got me a better visa. And then somebody said in English, he wants to know if you want to go to the hospital. And I said no. I only stayed the one night in Guatemala City, which makes sense. And I hitchhiked, but I also had hitchhikers because many of those fleas stayed with me. I had a little, backpack or bedroll or something. I had something with, like, I guess, blankets that I would use, to sleep in, even if I was sleeping outdoors, which I did eventually end up doing at one point. And some clothes, not a huge amount, but at least, enough for a change of clothes or whatever, including a pair of long pants that I had picked up in Belize somehow. And anyways, I managed to hitchhike to the town of Panajachel, and I looked at some of my rainbow family friends, and it wasn't hard to find them. They were in a bar, and they were on a huge drinking bin. Jack and what did I call him? Oh yes, Nathaniel. He one point he was queer. He said about me, he said, he's a queer, but he doesn't want to admit it. Later, I learned that he himself was bisexual. So little projection there. But again, my non-sexual phase kind of seemed weird to people down there. It didn't earn me a lot of respect. So, but then they got really drunk. And I think the same guy, Nathaniel, started pounding his fist on the counter. And the owner responded to this rowdy behavior by kicking everybody out. And then I did not help the situation. I think I'd had something to drink myself. And I started throwing my body against the door of the bar. And it was one of those scenes where, even though I was a kid, when people go into this group mind mentality, they would imitate what I did, whether it was well thought out or not. So they started throwing themselves against the door and wound up breaking the door down. At some point, we left, and John later went back. He had some diamonds that he gave them as to the bar owner as payment for him and his friends trashing the place. So I guess that was fair. I ended up staying in a place that the Rainbow family were in. And once they realized I had fleas, they put me in, I got my own room that way. They gave me my own room, which, I liked having my own room, I guess. because they were biting other people too, and I did not know how to get rid of them. And I scratched them. And at some point, and I'm not the only disorganized traveler that this has happened to, I met one in the same situation when I went back to Belize in the 90s. But what happened was the bites that I had been scratching turned into staph infection. So now I also had staph infection sores all over my legs, one on my foot, one on my hand. The scars are still there, although they have faded a lot. Not long after I arrived, there were these two kind of menacing shadow of the rainbow. The rainbow family, they're all like peace and love, and at their gatherings they'll yell, "We love you," lots and lots. They'll go to the top of the hill and we love you lots and lots and lots. But there's a definite shadow side to that, and that was observed when they trashed the bar, granted with my help and cooperation. And there were these two guys that were definitely the the darker shade of the rainbow. They were named, and I'm not going to hide their names because they don't deserve it. Their names were Bear and Kilo. So at some point, some guy who was selling some liquid LSD showed up, and John, basically, he bought it, and he said, it's too bad that you ended up with all our money. They pooled their money, to get it. And he said, I only did it because acid means more to me than money does. Which basically, it made sense to me at the time, but later I realized that he was basically saying, acid means more to me than food does, or whatever other sensible things you buy with money. And, that's kind of on him. And the guy who sold it, he said, well, I don't feel bad about this. I want to travel to some other places and I need some money to do it, which I now think fair enough. And so it was liquid. The first time I'd ever encountered that, and possibly the last. And they took an eyedropper and we pulled our eyelid down and they dripped the LSD into our eyes. They all did it. They did it for me. They did it for each other. There was one woman who said, she later said, when you were squirting that, when you were squirting drops in, I was praying, may there be many drops. So we all got high, and they had this this meal, like these ribs and a green salad, and I was hungry. And then Kilo, who has a wife and child, and apparently was known for stealing jewelry, as all the jewelry he could at rainbow gatherings. He arrived and felt like his space was being invaded, and he wanted to, he had a wife and a son who was about 4 or something, who was smarter than he was. I'll get to that. And so he felt that we were in his space, and he yelled, I'm going to throw this stuff back at you. That's where I'm at. And he did, but luckily none of it spilled. So like this bowl of green salad and this container of ribs just appeared in front of me. And I just I'm not daunted that he was in a bad mood. I have food in front of me, and I started eating it. And the others then also did that, because at first I think they were a little in shock, but not me. And so I do remember, like, this combination, the ribs, I guess the meat was kind of tough, and I was gnawing on it and gnawing on it, but I enjoyed gnawing. I was like, enjoyed being a carnivore. And I could also feel like the staph infection, itchy stuff on my skin. And there was all this different stuff going on, all this different kind of stimulus happening at the same time. And of course, all heightened by the LSD. And then we went somewhere else in Panajachel. And apparently, what had happened was some guy said, frio cerveza, meaning cold beer. And one of the women took that to mean free beer. And she spread the word. There was free beer, everybody. So, I had a beer, everybody had a beer. And then it turned out that what he'd actually, he'd said cold beer, not free beer, and it was not free, and we were expected to pay for it, and we were broke, pretty much. And so basically, one of the guys there had a baby, an infant, and the guy picked up his baby and held on to it as like a ransom to get his money back from all the beer we had taken. And he was tripping too. He started crying, and the woman, she said, why are you crying? And John said, because he feels. And he said, it's just that my baby, in exchange for some bottles of beer, it just doesn't seem, like it didn't seem like a fair exchange. And then she said, might as well name her. I don't remember her name. I'll call her Sue. So Sue said, it just seems to me that when we thought it was free, it was free. And when we started thinking that maybe it wasn't free anymore. And John said, people are people. People are not here to be used and abused like that. And I think they had some kind of a relationship, an intimate relationship. So they knew each other. So he felt free to give that kind of criticism, although I think anybody should have given her. Anyway, somehow we worked it out. Somebody might have come up with some money, and the guy got his baby back. So, whew, because you just don't do that down there. Another time I remember, we were back at the place we were staying. We were in the yard. This was a Mayan town also, but it was also, had become a backpacker's haven. And so these Mayans were walking around in these, in a version of their traditional clothing. It was super colorful, indigenous, like psychedelic, like multicolored designs all over it. And they were wearing it like that and selling it like that. And I just thought, well, that must be how the Mayans here dress. But somebody else told me that actually in the Mayan villages, away from the tourists, they wear the same style of clothing, but it wasn't colorful like that. The women would wear, a little colorful embroidered fringe around their necks sometimes, but that was about it. And they were only wearing these multicolored clothes in order to sell them to tourists, which I was disillusioned. Later, I found out that he was right because I went to one of those villages and he was correct. So some of us took this little boat trip. We were on Atitlan. We were on Lake Atitlan. So, of course, I swam there. I swam in the lake. You know, it was a little different. It was fresh water, and plus it was at a high elevation. So it was, it was harder. It wasn't so much buoyancy like inBelize in that protected cove. I could just swim way, 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 way out and way, way back in, which gave me the Garifuna teen had taught me how to do it, gave me some unearned self-confidence that got me in trouble sometimes in other oceans that were not like that. So we were on Lake Atitlan. That was nice. Yeah, we took a little boat to a less touristy, but still a bit touristy Mayan town of, I think, San Pedro, Colombia. There was a Mayan village in Belize that I went to with that name as well. San Pedro, Colombia. And on the boat, me and somebody, we had some acid, so I took half a tab of acid. And it didn't get me super high, but it got me kind of high. And then we got to the village and we were, joking around with the kids and stuff. And we met some other Westerners and smoked a joint. And then we went out into the woods, into what was actually, I believe, a coffee grove with these coffee trees. And so we spent the night there. There was me, there was the Black American guy. I'll just call him Ted. Yeah, if I can remember. And there was a young German woman, and there was this other young rainbow family name woman who changed her name every day. She changed her name, and after a while, people stopped going along with that and just called her one of the names stuck, and that was Frutus. So we called her Frutus. She talked about how she liked taking mushrooms and peyote together. And so we slept in the coffee grove. We had a conversation. Somehow I had gotten the impression that we had all agreed to start growing dreadlocks. I don't think any of the other ones understood it that way. I later realized, but I did, so I stopped combing my hair for a while, which made me look even crustier than I'm sure I already did. And then we had breakfast and we had coffee, and it was instant coffee. And that struck me. I'm like, we spent the night in a coffee grove, and now we're ordering coffee and it's instant. Of course, I drank it anyway. But there did seem to be something not right about that, which gave me a little insight into how global trade works, and how, later when I learned that places like in Ethiopia that were, in a famine that everybody heard about, but they were still exporting peas and stuff like that. it gave me a little insight. I also got some insight, a broader insight into the politics of the area from reading a guidebook. It was oriented towards hippie-ish backpackers. And it was, what was it called? The People's Guide to Guatemala. And, you know, most people, most guidebooks have a combination of like, this town has this good place to eat and that fun place to go. But there'll also be a section on basically the area, its history, you know, its current events. So I read a bunch of that, and I learned about how Guatemala and other parts of Central America / most of Central America and South America were under the thumb of the USA. And Belize wasn't, because it was still a British colony. When the British left, the Americans came in. And the government did wind up moving to a somewhat more to the right, more like industrial trade, you know, more like selling land to people in other countries that didn't live there, which used to be extremely hard to do, which they would build resorts on and so forth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You know, I became informed about the politics and the history of where I was, and that was the first time I learned, you know, that some of this brutal poverty that I was observed, like what I'd observed in Guatemala City, did not arise in a vacuum, because the United States government had a long role of overthrowing their democratically elected governments, which might have been vaguely socialist, but I'm not talking about, you know, Marxist-Leninist places like Cuba, although they tried that too. But the brutal right-wing fascist government leaders were largely installed, or the system that installed them was set up by the United States government and, you know, its branches like the CIA and such. In fact, in the 1950s, they straight up brought the elected Guatemalan government down by straight up bombing it, which I did not know, and I don't think most people know. Hey. When I had been on the truck, you know, going into the mountains towards Panajachel, I remember seeing the words Lucas Serra Presidente written in very large letters on the walls of the mountain, on the face of the mountain. So yeah, he had a publicity machine of some sort. We came back from Colombia, you know, we came back from the other village. We took the boat back. It wasn't a long boat trip. The next day, oh yeah, while we were in that village, we met some other, you know, gringos and smoked a joint with them while I was already on acid. And so the next day, with no intoxicants except a cup of coffee in me, we went back to our place in Panajachel. And I remember Nathaniel was having a conversation with Kilo and his family, and he was trying to talk sense to them, because they were being kind of mean and irrational. And he was being quite aggressive still. at least on the surface. And he was saying something, and Kilo said something about, I've never sucked a dick. And he said, you've never sucked a dick. You've never sucked a pussy. And said, I've sucked pussies, but I've never sucked dick. And he said, it's really the same thing. But anyway, I haven't sucked a dick in years, if that's so important. Boy, this would get me demonetized. If that's so important, is like how he said it. So, yeah. And then the other thing he said to his boy, who was about 12, he said, I've been with him when I've given him acid or mushrooms and listened to him talking about his visions, his visions that he had while he was high on psychedelics. This boy, who of course had shoulder length hair, but he was really young. And then he said, would you like to take acid and mushrooms with Uncle Nathaniel? And the boy said, no, I want milk. And that's why I think the kid was smarter than his father was. Yeah. So then he disappeared for a while. And one night I was asleep alone in my room, and Bear woke me up, just stuck his head in, and he said, oh, is it just you in here? I said, yes. Of course, he knew I was broke. And then he stuck his head back in, and he said, is there anyone else in here with you? I said, no. So he left again and didn't come back. But the next day, one of the women who was, living with us, Bear was gone, and one of the women had her traveler's check stolen. Actually, I think Bear and Kilo were gone. So we thought it's got to be one of them or both of them. We were right. But Kilo came back first, and they said, did you steal a woman's traveler's checks? And he said, hell no. If I had traveler's checks, I would have gone to Guatemala City and cashed them, and I wouldn't be back here at all. All right. So not exactly a moral grounds for not having taken them. He just didn't have the opportunity to do it. And Bear did not come back. I think we met up with him back in Livingston, but he didn't come back to our place in Panajachel. So clearly he was the one who had taken it. And by now, my staph infection was pretty bad. And the Rainbow family was giving advice that wasn't very good. They told me to cut the legs off of my long sleeve pants to get air on them. Mostly it just let bugs land on them. And later Vanessa was annoyed that I destroyed these perfectly good pants when I went back to Punta Gorda. And so then I somehow managed to see a doctor. Somebody must have given me some money or something. I saw a doctor and shouted to him, and he gave me some pills, antibiotics, and he said, if you get me another $1, I can give you an injection as well that will help you. I went to a cafe, and I happened to meet one of the women that I had stayed with in in Mendocino, California, and I had been kind of rude by leaving without leaving a note. And she mentioned that. She said, I think that was kind of shitty of you. She was right. She also said, but I realized it was a difficult house guest that drove you out. And I was wearing these short pants, so my staph infection was evident. So I said, like, yeah, a doctor just gave me some pills and said I could get an injection of antibiotics as well if I could get, but I kind of mumbled, I need $1. And she said, you need a dog? Or you need a doll? Something like that. And her boyfriend said, give him $1. No, really, give him $1. So she gave me $1. I went to the doctor and he gave me an injection and I took all the pills, but it still wasn't enough, obviously. And I, as will happen in those situations, it subsided for a bit and then came back. So these rainbow family people said, you know what you need is you need to soak in a hot spring, and we know where there is one. So they took me there, and then the people who were renting the place, they got mad and kicked us off because it was at least temporarily their property. Later, the guy who was renting the place, he saw me on the streets or whatever, and he said, okay, I found out you have staph infection. I already knew that I didn't like you people, trespassing in my hot spring. But now that I know you have staph infection, if I see you in there again, I will beat you out of it. This was an American guy. So I'm like, oh, all right, point taken. There was this other guy who told me, he told me about a book he'd read. He said, yeah, there was this anthropologist in Guatemala, and he asked, the people who was around, who are the weirdest people you know? And then he asked them, who are the weirdest people you know? And then he went to those people and asked them, who are the weirdest people you know of? And eventually he wound up with this Mayan sub-tribe called the Lacedonians. I think they're the Lacondo, actually, or at least that's what they're called in Mexico. And that's where those are the ones who did the Chiapas rebellion. But my mind was very impressionable. And I was like, okay, and then he said, and then he disappeared. He went to the Lacedonians. He disappeared for years. And then he came back and told people where all these famous Mayan ruins were, because he had learned that from the people that he was living with. And so I got it into my mind that I was going to go to a Mayan village way off the tourist track. I'd go to somewhere and then I'd go on and on until it's, the road kind of ended. And that's basically what I did. Before I get there, I remember the people we were renting our place from were also Mayans, and they were kind of upset about it. They were basically saying in Spanish, we rented you the house and the yard, but we didn't rent you, but We didn't rent you the firewood or the papayas that are in the trees. And he left, and Fructus said, you know, she was going to pick a papaya. And I said, well, I don't think those Guatemalans really want you to do that. And she said, well, who cares? You know, once again, we were anti-private property, you know, we went where we chose. It wasn't till many years later that I learned in an cultural anthropology class that in Mayan culture, if you rent somebody's land and or home, yeah, you rent their home and the yard, but that does not include the rights to your firewood, to the firewood, or the fruit on the fruit trees, or any of their crops or anything like that. So that's why that happened. There was this one guy who was like, he was a grown adult. He was pretty nice to me. He was hanging out with he was an American hanging out with the Rainbow family, and he would buy me, you know, something to eat and so forth. Maybe he panhandled it, some money up, I don't know. But he was also a bit sexually obsessive, you know. I was in my abstinent phase, and he was saying, well, maybe if we go such and such place, we'll get laid, which he clearly was not. And apparently some of the Rainbow family folks got a little creeped out by him. I just thought it was a little odd, but no biggie. He's feeding me, right? And that came up again later. So then I took a detour from Panajachel, ending up in the Mayan village of Magdalene. And this is already a long video, so I will end it here. Bye-bye. Sorry.